Well, let's have a look at the newspapers for you this morning, and taking us through them today, Nigel Nelson, political editor of the Sunday Mirror, and Sophia Gaston, director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Good to see you both this morning. Let's start, Sophia, with the G7, should we, on the front of the FT this morning?
Yes, well, this is the big weekend of the G7 summit in Cornwall. Yesterday, we saw all the other world leaders arrive one by one with all the theatrics around that. Prime Minister Johnson held a series of bilateral meetings with Canadian and Japanese leaders. But the big story yesterday was trying to come to some concrete commitments on vaccination, so how we're going to jab the rest of the world. And there was a pledge for 1 billion jabs by the end of next year, which I think some campaigners have pointed out is probably not going to be enough. There was also a big commitment from the UK to investments in girls' education as well. So I think, there was a very strong focus on let's start off on safe ground on something we can all come to agree on. And that was the importance of vaccinations and the importance of spending on foreign aid. A little bit tricky, of course, because the UK is going through a process of temporarily reducing its aid spending. I think the government probably wanted to come out in the front gates and get on the front foot on that to make sure that wasn't going to be a subject of scrutiny of the summit. But I think a strong start for the summit, okay. But we are getting into it today.
Yeah, indeed. Nigel, the Express has, it's like an episode of Yes Minister, isn't it, for those of us old enough to remember?
It certainly is, yes. And these are sausage wars that look set to continue, and certainly it'll be discussed in the margins of the G7. This is not really about whether it's ridiculous to stop the importation of sausages from mainland Britain into Northern Ireland. EU rules are quite clear on this, that chilled meat can't be taken from a non-EU country into one that has to obey EU rules, which of course Northern Ireland does. What this is really about is whether or not we stick to our word. We've made an agreement on this. Certainly, let's try and negotiate our way through it. But if that fails, I think we have to keep to our obligations.
But when does common sense prevail, though, Nigel?
Well, it's not a question of common sense.
Well, it is, though. It is to an extent. I know the point you're making, but a lot of people watching will just be saying, well, why does this need to happen at all?
Well, when we were in the EU, we could not have imported chilled meat from outside the EU. So this is a rule they've got, and that's why my argument is it's not whether the rule is sensible or not. It may well not be, and it does seem ridiculous you can eat a sausage in England but not in Northern Ireland that's made in England. What this is about is we negotiated this agreement, and all I'm arguing is that if it's bound to throw up a few anomalies, but at the end of the day, we have to stick to our word.
Meanwhile, the Times, Sophia, talking about a full-on trade war.
Yes, I think really the way to think about this is you've got the question about the sanctity of the EU single market and the sanctity of the UK single market. And obviously both sides want to protect their own. We, of course, did make an agreement that we would enforce these checks, and unfortunately we're not upholding them at the moment. Obviously, as you say, there is a degree of common sense here. The bigger picture here is, well, that, obviously Northern Ireland, nobody wants to see any conflict or instability there. So I think there is the will to work through this, but it's going to be a tough day for Boris Johnson. The EU has a strong representation in Cornwall, and we know he's got all his bilateral meetings with them. So he's going to be really having his feet held to the fire today.
Where do you see the compromise coming, if at all, Sophia?
It's really difficult. You essentially either have to put a sort of border down the Irish Sea, or you have to put a border on the island of Ireland, and there's not really any good way around that. I'm hoping that there can be a fudge somehow found through this, because I think both the UK and the EU are rather good at finding those. But the fact is that both sides are going to have to move a little bit on this one if we want to move forward.
Oh, Sophia, sausage and fudge. gets very confusing this morning. Meanwhile, Nigel, we're all looking forward to this sort of glorious summer, weren't we? Well, kicking off on June 21st. Telegraph saying it's unlikely to happen.
Yeah, I think we sort of known about this. This has been coming along for some time. The situation is now that it looks like we're going to have a month's delay from the June the 21st unlocking that we were expecting. So we're now looking towards July the 19th. I have to say that, disappointing though it is, it's probably the right thing to do. Cases are running at 8,000 a day as of yesterday. They're doubling every 9 days, so we're talking about 16,000 cases a day by next week. Therefore, next month it'll be something like 64,000 cases a day if we go at the current rate. Hospitalizations are low thanks to vaccination, but they won't stay low on those kind of figures. So sadly, I think there's no alternative but to postpone the ending of restrictions. The alternative would be going into another lockdown.
Yeah, I mean, the Mail's got this as well, Sophia. I mean, the argument that some will make against this is saying, well, Nigel's talking about this sort of exponential growth, but some people say, well, with the vaccine rollout as progressed as it is, surely that won't happen.
The problem that we've got is that this new Delta variant does seem to really push the limits of the vaccines. We know that you have to really be fully jabbed to get the effects. And unfortunately, you know, the vaccinations, it's really a 14-week proposition from when you get your first dose to when you're fully protected. So it's really just a race against time. You've got a chain which has haunted us over the past 18 months, which is the link between cases, hospitalizations and deaths. We're hoping on the preliminary data that the hospitalizations and deaths, that chain is being significantly weakened, but we haven't quite yet broken the link between cases and hospitalizations. And as long as that's looming over us, that's going to mean there's a risk of the NHS being overwhelmed and not being able to treat people for all other sorts of things. So it really does feel like we're hanging in the balance here. I think the British people recognise we don't have much choice.